Petra Voss had spent 45 minutes in a dress that was slowly winning the war against her ribcage, and the man she'd worn it for hadn't even had the decency to text. She'd bought the dress 3 weeks ago. Burgundy wrap with a deep V that her best friend Denise had insisted was absolutely you, while Petra had stood in the dressing room, thinking it was absolutely a size too small. She'd bought it anyway. She'd also worn a pair of heels she hadn't broken in yet, skipped lunch because she'd been nervous, and driven 40 minutes in Thursday rush-hour traffic to a steakhouse in downtown Boston called Archer's that had a 3-month waitlist and a sommelier who spoke to you like you'd personally offended his grandmother if you ordered the house red. She'd made the reservation herself. His name was Kyle Merritt. She'd met him at a continuing education seminar 6 weeks ago. Tax law update, riveting stuff, and he'd asked for her number while she was refilling her coffee. He was handsome in a standard, forgettable way, the kind of handsome that photographs well and doesn't translate to anything in person. But Petra Voss had not been asked out in 11 months, and she'd said yes before she could overthink it. The reservation was for 7 o'clock. At 7:15 she'd checked her phone. At 7:30 she'd asked the hostess, a reed-thin woman named Brittany who wore her pity very visibly, if anyone had called ahead. At 7:45, Petra had done something she rarely let herself do in public. She'd ordered a drink, just the one, just to have something to do with her hands. By 8 o'clock, she was on her second glass of Malbec and the bread basket had come and gone, and she was doing her absolute best not to make eye contact with the couple 3 tables over who had definitely noticed. The thing about being a woman who takes up space, and Petra did, she knew it, 31 years of knowing it, was that you were never invisible when you wanted to be. You were invisible when you wanted someone to see you. But sit alone at a nice restaurant for an hour past your reservation time, in a dress you bought specifically for tonight, and every person in the room would find you without trying. She knew what they were thinking. She'd thought it herself, in darker moments, in bathroom mirrors. She'd even, somewhere around 7:50, pulled out her phone and looked at Kyle's last text, "Can't wait, see you there," and turned the words over like they might mean something different if she looked long enough. They didn't. At 8:05 she got a text, not from Kyle, from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Kyle's roommate, who was apparently delivering the news that Kyle had decided not to come because he'd run into his ex-girlfriend that afternoon, and things were complicated. There was a sorry at the end. Lowercase, no punctuation. Petra read it twice. She set down her phone. She picked up her wine. She finished it. Then she felt something move through her. Not sadness, not embarrassment, though both of those were in there somewhere behind the ribs that the dress was still compressing. But something hotter and cleaner than either of those things. She was angry. She had broken in shoes she hadn't worn yet. She had skipped the leftover soup she'd made on Sunday that was actually very good. She had driven 40 minutes and tipped the valet, and sat in this restaurant for over an hour, and Kyle Merritt had decided, at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, that he was not coming. She was not going to cry in Archer's. She was going to leave Archer's, drive home, eat the soup, and delete his number. Petra folded her napkin, neatly because she was a CPA who'd been raised by a woman who believed in returning things better than you found them, placed it on the table, and reached for her purse. She was standing. She had her coat. She was very deliberately not looking at the couple 3 tables over, and she was perhaps 6 steps from the exit when the front door opened. She registered it the way you register weather, peripherally, without intention, and then she stopped registering it because she'd found the exit, and then every single person in the dining room went quiet. Not hushed, not the polite settling that happens when someone notable enters a room. Quiet the way a forest goes quiet when something large moves through it. The sommelier, mid-sentence with a table by the window, stopped speaking. Brittany, the hostess, went very still. Petra had not yet turned around, but she felt it. The shift in air pressure, or something like it. The way a room reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. She turned around. The man who had walked through the door of Archer's was not particularly tall, which surprised her later when she thought about it, because he had the quality of taking up an enormous amount of space without requiring it physically. He was broad-shouldered, dark-suited, somewhere in his early 40s, with a kind of face that had been carved rather than assembled, sharp jaw, darker eyes, a quality of absolute stillness that Petra associated with people who had never once in their lives been uncertain about what they were about to do next. He had 4 men with him. They spread through the room without being told to, the way water fills a container. His gaze moved across the restaurant with the same temperature as a security camera, assessing, recording, settling on nothing for long, until it settled on her. Petra, who had spent most of her adult life engineering herself to be unnoticeable in rooms full of people who made her feel like she was too much, did not know what to do with being looked at that way. It wasn't a look she recognized. It wasn't the look of a man noticing her figure and making a private decision about it. It was something more clinical than that, and somehow, paradoxically, more personal. Like he had walked into this room already knowing she would be here, she decided she was imagining things and turned back toward the door. Ms. Voss, she stopped. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself for anyone, that had simply learned that the world would quiet down enough to hear it. She turned around again. He was closer than she expected. Not invasively close, not threatening. Just closer than the distance she'd placed between them when she turned away. "I'm sorry," she said, because her brain defaulted to apology when startled. "Do I know you?" "No," he said. "But you've been doing my books for 8 months." The sentence rearranged itself in her head a few times. She was a forensic accountant. She worked for a mid-size firm in Cambridge, Dalton and Associates, and she handled, among other clients, several holding companies, a logistics operation out of New Jersey, and a real estate trust that had always struck her as unusually clean for how much money moved through it. She had never met the principal behind that trust. She had only ever dealt with a man named Gerard, who was soft-spoken and nervous and sent her information by courier. "You're," she said. "Aurelio Set," he said. "Just the name. No title, no explanation, the way people say their name when they've never needed to explain who they are." She knew the name. Everyone in Boston who worked in finance knew the name, the way you know the name of a weather system, as a category of event, not as a person. Aurelio Sette was not the kind of person you expected to encounter in a restaurant. He was the kind of person other people arranged their lives around, like furniture around a structural wall. "I see," said Petra, which was not adequate but was what she had. He glanced at the table she'd just vacated, the empty wine glasses, the refolded napkin. Then back at her, and there was something in his expression, not pity, she would have walked out immediately if it had been pity. Something more like attention, like he was filing information. "You were leaving," he said. "I was," she said. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, but also not a question. "Mr. Set," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she credited to 8 years of sitting across from IRS auditors. "I appreciated the Petra, still even, still quiet. Sit down, you haven't eaten." She blinked. "How do you know that? 'Cause you were here at 7 and it's 8:15 and there's no food on your table? Sit down." She sat down. She was not entirely sure why. She would analyze that later, at length, lying awake at approximately 2 in the morning. For now, she sat, because there was something in the way he said it. Not commanding so much as certain, the way you're certain about gravity, that made standing seem like the more difficult option. He sat across from her. One of his men materialized from somewhere, and a waiter appeared in the next 30 seconds, which was faster service than Petra had received in the previous hour and 15 minutes. "They'll eat," Set said to the waiter, who nodded and vanished. "They," Petra said. "You. And I'm eating because I haven't either." He glanced at her. "Unless you'd prefer to leave." She thought about the soup at home. She thought about the 40-minute drive. She thought about Kyle Merritt's roommate and his lowercase sorry. "No," she said. "I think I'll stay." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile, exactly. It was more like the acknowledgement that a smile could happen theoretically in a universe adjacent to this one. The food arrived faster than was possible for a restaurant, with a 3-month wait list, which told her things she filed away silently. She ordered the sea bass because she'd been looking at it on the menu for an hour, and she had earned it. He ordered simply, without looking at the menu, which told her he'd been here before. They sat across from each other, with the easy awkwardness of two people who had never met and somehow had things to discuss. "Gerard sends your files personally," she said, because she was a person who dealt in facts when she didn't know what else to do. "I assumed you were overseas." "I travel," he said. "I've been in Boston for 3 weeks, and you came to Archer's tonight because you work here 3 days a week," he said, and at her expression, "Not you specifically. A man named Vincent Archard holds a stake in this property that is not documented in any filing I can find, and I wanted to understand why he chose this particular location for a meal with a city councilman last Tuesday." Petra's brain, which had been running on residual embarrassment and Malbec, suddenly and involuntarily sharpened. "A steak that's not documented," she said slowly, "in a restaurant that has a councilman coming through regularly. You see it," he said. And the way he said it made her feel like she'd done something right, rather than simply stated the obvious. "You're thinking money movement," she said, "city contracts, something zoning adjacent." "I'm thinking someone has been very careful for a very long time," he said, "and has gotten sloppy." She picked up her fork, turned it over once, set it down. The holding structure on a restaurant like this would be, there'd be layers. If someone wanted to obscure a partial stake, they'd run it through a management company. Probably registered in Delaware. Probably with a name that sounds like an LLC that does maintenance consulting. He looked at her across the table. It was a different quality of looking than before. Before he'd been cataloging. Now he was actually seeing her. "Clean water advisory services," he said. She almost laughed. "They always do something virtuous sounding." She picked up her fork again. "That's not hard to find if you know where to look. What's the anchor entity?" "A trust administered through a firm in Cambridge," he said. She paused. He let her pause. She was learning, extremely patient. "Dalton and Associates," she said. "A different partner," he said immediately. "Not your accounts. I verified that before I chose to sit down." She let that land. He had verified she wasn't involved before he'd approached her. She didn't know if that was reassuring or unsettling. She decided it was professional. "Martin Holt," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Martin Holt was a senior partner. He had a corner office, a photograph with the governor, and a coffee mug that said "World's okayest golfer," that she had always found deeply incongruous with his actual personality. "He's been managing the Clean Water Trust for 4 years," she said. It wasn't a question. She was working through it out loud because that was how her brain operated, and she'd spent enough of her life apologizing for it that she'd eventually stopped. 4 years and 7 months, Seth said. "The zoning variance on the Harborview development," she said. "The one that passed in February, March of last year?" "February 14th, he said. "Someone fast-tracked that. There was a piece about it in the Globe. I remember thinking the timeline was. I thought someone just called in a favor." She looked at him. "It wasn't a favor. It was a payment," he said simply. "One I intend to document very precisely." The food in front of her had gone partially cold. She didn't care. Her brain was running the way it did when she found something genuinely wrong in a set of books. Not the satisfaction of catching a minor error, but the louder, deeper satisfaction of understanding a whole pattern, seeing how the pieces had been arranged to be invisible. "You're going to need a paper trail that starts outside the trust," she said. "If Martin's been careful, everything inside Dalton will be clean. The movement will be in the counterparties. The restaurant's vendors. Line and service, produce supplier. Look for vendors that invoice at a premium and have no verifiable operations." He was looking at her the way people looked at things they hadn't expected to find. Not surprised exactly, more like confirmed. "You've done this before," he said. "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "Finding what's been hidden is the job. For whom? The IRS, mostly. Some private clients. Insurance fraud, twice. Once for a bankruptcy trustee who suspected the owner had moved assets." She paused. "I've never worked for." She didn't finish the sentence. "No," he said. "I expect not." They were quiet for a moment. The restaurant had resumed its normal register around them. Conversations. The soft percussion of silverware. Someone at the bar laughing too loudly. Petra became aware that she'd eaten most of her sea bass without noticing. "Why didn't you reach out through Gerard?" she asked. "Because what I'm asking isn't in the normal scope of our arrangement," he said. "And because I wanted to meet you first." "Why?" He considered the question the way he seemed to consider everything, without hurry, without performance. "Because the person managing money I trust should be someone I can look in the eye," he said. "Gerard handles logistics. I handle people." She should have found that chilling. She was aware that it should have chilled her, that the appropriate response to an evening that had taken this particular turn was significantly more alarm than she was experiencing. She filed that away too, in the folder she kept for things to examine later when she wasn't sitting in a burgundy dress that she'd bought for a man who'd sent a roommate with a lowercase sorry. "There's one thing you should know," she said. He waited. "If I find something in those books, I document it completely. I don't summarize, I don't curate, I don't leave gaps. You'd have everything I find, including things you might not want documented. I know what I have," he said. "That's not what I mean," she said. "What I mean is, I work clean. Always. That's not negotiable. Something in his face shifted, not softened, but opened the way a door opens. I don't want it any other way, he said, and his voice had a quality she couldn't name, something that suggested this was the sentence he had been waiting to say to someone for a considerable amount of time. They finished dinner. His men waited with extraordinary discretion. The sommelier never once spoke to her like she'd offended him. When the check came to him without her asking, she had the reflexive impulse to reach for her own card, and then looked at herself doing it and chose, for once, not to. I'd like to look at the vendor records, she said instead, businesslike, which was her armor, and also, she was slowly learning, not entirely armor. The restaurant's supplier invoices. I can tell you in 48 hours if the structure is what we think. We, he said. She looked up. You said what we think, he said. She hadn't noticed. Poor word choice, she said. No, he said. Accurate word choice. He stood when she stood. He walked her to the door, which she hadn't expected. Not the walk, not the easy assumption of it, not the way his hand briefly settled at the back of her shoulder as they moved through the room, light as a question. Around them, archers continued to breathe and murmur, the ordinary world carrying on around something that was, Petra thought, probably not ordinary at all. At the door she stopped. Mr. Set, she said. Aurelio. She considered it. Aurelio. The name felt different in her mouth than it had in her head. More real, more specific. The man I was waiting for tonight texted to say he wasn't coming because his ex-girlfriend was complicated. He said nothing. He let her continue. I think I needed someone to know that, she said, so I should say out loud that it was his loss and not mine, and that the soup I'm going home to eat is genuinely very good and I'm fine. She looked at him steadily. I'm fine. Aurelio Set looked at Petra Voss. The burgundy dress, the heels she'd broken in for someone who hadn't shown up, the careful precision in her eyes, and he said quietly, he passed over someone who found fraud in 45 minutes over Seabase. That's not complicated. That's catastrophic judgment. She laughed, actually laughed, sharp and genuine, the kind of laugh that startled her because she hadn't expected to make it. The files, he said before she could leave. I'll have Gerard contact you tomorrow. I'll be ready, she said. She walked out of Archer's into the November air, heels clicking on the wet sidewalk, and she did not look back. Not because she wasn't tempted, but because she didn't need to. The city was cold and loud and full of light, and Petra Voss had, against every conceivable expectation, just had the best dinner of the worst date of her life. The soup, when she got home, was excellent. She ate it at her kitchen counter, still in the burgundy dress, and she opened her laptop and she started a new file. She labeled it Set, Clean Water Preliminary, and then she paused, and then she added, in parentheses, the date. She had been building cases against invisible money for 8 years. She had caught people who believed themselves uncatchable. She was good at it in the quiet way that serious people are good at things. Not loudly, not with flourish, but with a depth that did not run out. Aurelio Sette had looked her in the eye across a restaurant table, and seen all of that without her explaining a word of it. And that was, Petra thought, scrolling through the first of what would be dozens of documents over the coming weeks, an extraordinarily rare thing. She'd think about that more. Later, right now she had books to read.